All right, the Revelation, which concludes our New Testament survey. So the outline of the book, and this can be outlined lots of different ways. This is me throwing it together, the way I see the book put together. First chapter is kind of like a prologue. Then second and third chapter are the letters to the 7 churches of Asia. Chapters 4 through 19 are a vision of the end of the age that is coming. And then Revelation 20 through 22 hit events that happen after that.
I'm the only person who didn't bring a pen.
All right.
Sure, you have to be disruptive.
I'm now on video.
Yep.
Okay.
All right, so moving into the prologue. John was on the island of Patmos when he wrote this. It is approximately 100 AD, although it is tough to nail that down. He has a vision of 7 lampstands, and it is plainly said in the passage that the 7 lampstands are 7 churches, specifically the 7 churches of Asia. And in the hand of a man he sees standing there, which is Jesus, he sees 7 stars, and these 7 stars are angels or messengers of the churches. That actually becomes an important piece of information for interpreting lots of other things that come up in the book of Revelation. What is a star? Stars and angels are somewhat corresponding to one another quite regularly. Jesus is walking among the lampstands, and it's fascinating that the imagery of a church is that of a lampstand, because a lampstand shines or enables light to be shown forth and cast fewer shadows in a room. So he's writing from Patmos, which is an island in the Aegean Sea. Some people think he was exiled there. It could be that he was just hanging out there in retirement. I honestly don't know why he's there. Nothing in Revelation specifically says. So it's going to be extra biblical information that tells us why he's there. But John clearly has a pretty strong relationship for these 7 churches in Asia.
And they're all close to him.
They're all relatively close to him. You know, the one in Ephesus was founded by Priscilla and Aquila, and Paul spent a fair amount of time there. Laodicea was influenced by Paul because he wrote a letter to them specifically, and it's right next door to Hierapolis and Colossae. The other ones are not specifically mentioned in the book of Acts or in Paul's ministry, to my knowledge, but you know, a good 30 to 40 some years has gone by, and the gospel message was really thoroughly shared in the province of Asia while Paul was in Ephesus. So it's not surprising that it got to these 7 churches. There's an interesting pattern to the letters to the various churches. Ooh. Letters to the and churches. And 7 are the same key on the keyboard. So that's supposed to be the 7 churches.
Okay.
Yep. I didn't know this was a chiasmus actually, but the church in Ephesus gets corrected, the church in Smyrna gets encouraged, and then Pergamum, Thyatira, and Sardis all get corrected, and then Philadelphia gets encouraged, and then Laodicea gets corrected. The corrections are not particularly harsh. Usually there's some positive redeeming element brought out about every single church, some more than others, but there's a word of correction that Jesus specifically is speaking to those churches. But it also gives us the idea that each church is a little different and has their own unique foibles, strengths, and weaknesses and such. So it is today. And just like that, we're 3 chapters in. So then all of a sudden John goes into a vision in heaven, and he's in the Spirit, he says. And he is in the throne room of God, and he sees the throne of God, and he actually sees God himself sitting on the throne. And his appearance is that of jasper and carnelian. And I was like, oh my goodness, we can actually see what God looks like. And those are red stones, if I remember right. You can look those up later. He's surrounded by rainbows, and there's lots of other things that are described in the throne room. But some of the specific elements is he's surrounded by the 24 thrones for the 24 elders. And there are 4 living creatures, and they show up from time to time through the whole rest of the book. One looks like a lion, one looks like an ox. The third one has the face of a man, the rest of the creatures not described, and the other one is like a flying eagle, specifically.
The 4 living creatures remind me of the 4-faced critter from Daniel.
Yep.
And do we know who the 24 elders are?
Nope.
Just
Don't know.
so it could be angelic beings.
Yeah, I mean, I've heard people claim that they're for the 12 apostles and the 12 sons of Jacob, but John is one of the apostles, and so for him to have a vision of himself in heaven would be strange. Be like an out-of-body experience, which he was having, I guess.
Or
But
you see the future himself.
yeah, I don't know. Anyhow, so that was one point of speculation, but it's just that, it's speculation. It's not identified, and it's not even clear that they're human. And in fact, there's a good chance they're not.
Angelic beings.
Good chance. Don't know. One of the distinctive features of the 4 living creatures is they're covered in eyeballs even underneath their wings, which is interesting.
I
Like
saw
spiders.
Mm-hmm.
I saw an AI rendition of what that would actually look like. It's kind of scary.
Yeah, it is. But everything is worshiping God in the throne room of heaven. And Revelation 4 is largely a chapter that just sets the scene of things that are coming to pass. Moving on to 5, we start getting a plot here. There's a scroll with 7 seals on it.
That's a good visual.
Yep, the seals are not harbor seals, minke seals, fur seals. Elementary students have a hard time with seeing 7 seals because it sounds like a zoo. They are a wax seal, much like on this image. So, the question is, who is worthy to break the seals? And John weeps because all of heaven and earth are searched and no one is found who can break the seals. And then he's encouraged by the angel who's with him and says, look, a lamb is deemed worthy. And it takes the scroll and then he begins breaking the seals. And it takes a whole chapter to establish that. And if you have questions, by all means bring them up as we go on here.
I take it that the lamb is Jesus.
Yep, the lamb here is clearly Jesus. It's a lamb that looks like it was slain. It's clearly alive.
Yeah, probably.
That's just interesting.
Yep. There's an interesting Hebraicism that John wrote into the book of Revelation in this particular chapter that my Hebrew professor wrote out. So Revelation was written in Greek, but John himself is not Greek. He's Hebrew. So even if he's writing in Greek, just like when we speak Spanish in the English syntax, and so we rearrange things horribly.
It's so awful.
It's
to
so
listen
bad.
to.
Yes.
Oh,
Anyway.
That's like me speaking German.
Right, and the way, yeah. So you learn a foreign language, you just think in your mother tongue and translate straight into that. And so in Hebrew, if you're going to say that that camera is between Annabelle and Matthew, the way you would actually say it in Hebrew is the camera is between Annabelle and between Matthew.
Yeah.
That's interesting.
So that has caused a lot of confusion on one verse in here, because it's trying to figure out where the lamb is. Because it says that the lamb is between the throne and between the elders. And how are you between the throne? Like,
Okay.
does that mean you're sitting on the throne?
But
And plenty of translations park the lamb right on the throne, even though God himself is sitting on it.
We're in a circle all around the throne.
Yep. So it's easy to be in the middle of a circle, but it's hard to be between the throne. Because in a straight translation of it, it sounds like he's between the throne and then also between the elders. Easy to be in the center of the elders.
So he's physically inside of the throne.
Right. So
It's just
I think the ESV is one of the first translations I saw that actually pegs this as, and the Lamb stood between the throne and the elders. That would be the way we would render it in English, assuming that John's Greek was just a touch sloppy. It's kind of interesting though, because this actually authenticates John's authorship of it, as he's not using particularly sharp Greek. He's writing with a Hebrew mindset. And you find some of these in the New Testament, especially from some of the more Hebraic people. Paul was really sharp on his Greek, so his Greek is a lot stronger. But Matthew has some really interesting things.
That authenticates that the New Testament was not just written by a whole bunch of, by one person, because
Yep.
if it was written by one person, all of the Greek would either be sloppy or flawless, unless they were an absolute genius, which they probably.
Yep. That was a cottage industry, how to forge documents and ascribe other authorship to it. But anyhow, moving along here. Starts breaking the seals. And in Revelation 6, we have 6 of the 7 seals opened. So the first 4 are where we get the 4 riders, or the 4 horsemen of the apocalypse from. You have a rider on a white horse who's bent on conquest. Second rider is on a red horse. I believe it says he's able to take peace, which seems like he'd be bringing war. Third one is the rider on a black horse. And this is where the angel says a day's wages for a quart of wheat and day's wages for 3 quarts of barley, which is essentially ridiculous prices for food, even back then. And speaks of famine and scarcity. And the fourth rider is on a pale horse, and his rider is death. And Hades is a second character following behind him. And they kill by the sword, famine, and plague.
So basically a combination of the previous 3.
Yep. Although plague is not mentioned in the first 3. Plague is unique to the 4th. The 5th seal does not bring any judgment on earth that I can see, but the martyrs that are under the throne of God in the throne room ask him the question, how long until you avenge our blood? And that is what happens when the 5th seal is opened. The 6th seal brings a great earthquake and signs in the heavens. This verse we're actually going to look at. It is of significance in my mind. It says, the sun became black as sackcloth, and the full moon became like blood, and the stars of the sky fell to the earth. And there are lots of corollaries to this verse. 3 of them are found in Jesus' description of the end of the age in the Gospels. During Crucifixion Week, if you remember, he's talking to his disciples about the end of the age. So he said the temple's going to be ripped stone from stone. They asked him when this was going to happen. And the Matthew, Mark, and Luke account all describe a similar event. Joel also describes this, and Peter quotes from Joel in Acts 2:20. Isaiah speaks of this twice in 2 separate prophecies, and in Ezekiel 32, another apocalyptic passage on the judgment of Babylon, it speaks of this as well.
Sounds a lot like a volcano.
Yeah, the sun becoming black as sackcloth could usually be a volcanic cloud. It could be an eclipse. It could be any number of other
See,
things
the problem
too.
with an eclipse is that the moon cannot be blood if the sun is black because of an eclipse. You can't see both of them at the same time.
Mm-hmm.
Lunar eclipses tend to turn the moon red though.
Yep, they do. And they come within 2 weeks' time. So you have a solar eclipse followed by a lunar eclipse or vice versa.
Wait, there was a lunar eclipse recently?
Mm-hmm.
Or
Yeah, it just was on the other side of the earth, so we couldn't see it from here. So, but that sign, in my opinion, is a point of connection between a whole bunch of different apocalyptic passages. So when you're reading through another one, you come across this, it is probably a connection to the 6th seal, which I find handy. I've never found anybody else who has ever pointed this out, but it seems like there's
it makes
some
sense.
overlap there.
Stars in the sky fall to the earth.
Mm-hmm.
Meteor shower, probably. Except they actually.
Well, that's a good question. Now, what is it that a star is in the book of Revelation often?
Angels.
An angel. So is it a star or is it an angel?
That would be terrifying if it was
It
really.
would be terrifying.
Either one would be terrifying in my mind. I don't want large rocks coming down from outer space, nor do I want angels falling out of the heavens. Like,
It would be
See,
like everybody's
both
worst
of them
alien
should stay
invasion
up
nightmare
there.
come true.
yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
So that ends up becoming a recurring challenge in the book of Revelation. Is this a literal description of what's going to happen, or is this a figure of speech? Is it symbolic? And that becomes an enormous challenge to then start sorting things out. So the moon turning to blood and the sun turning to darkness could even just simply refer to God and his witness here on earth. Because God is light, and if light stops shining, darkness prevails. And the moon is those who reflect his light. They're not a source of light, the moon reflects his light. So that could be referring to the church.
Ooh.
See, there's
I'll pass on
different
that
angles on how
interpretation.
you can take this, and it becomes exceedingly challenging.
Mhm.
Moving into Revelation 7, I'll point out the seventh seal is still sealed. But at this point, he has another vision of the 144,000 who are sealed. First, he sees 4 angels that have the power to harm the land and the sea. And they are restrained at the 4 corners of the earth, I believe. And then the 144,000 that are sealed are servants of God, 12,000 from 12 tribes each. The list of tribes is missing the tribe of Dan, and it doesn't mention Ephraim directly. It says Joseph and Manasseh, Ephraim being one of the other sons of Joseph. So either Manasseh gets 18,000 and Ephraim only gets 6,000, or Joseph equates to Ephraim because Manasseh is independent. I've just always wondered about that myself. I can't explain why it's that way.
And the ordering of it, Manasseh's like 6th or something.
Yep.
6th, and Joseph is 11th.
Don't know. So since they're from the tribes, a lot of people think that these are Jews who are believers because their tribal identity. Other people have various different interpretations. The Jehovah's Witnesses always thought that it was them until they started numbering far in excess of 144,000, and then they had to figure out what do we do with the extras because we need to give them some measure of hope. And so, yeah, different people come up with different explanations as to who those are and where they are. All we know here is John sees them.
Probably not the Israelites.
So then he has another vision. He's standing in heaven. He sees every nation, tribe, people, and language gathered in the throne room of God there. And it says specifically that they had come out of the great tribulation. This is often connected to the tribulation that Jesus references in Matthew 24 and the other gospel accounts. And is often connected to the idea of a rapture. Mikhail, you have a thought?
If it's every language, does that include the Elvish language that Tolkien created?
If you can find people that speak that as their native tongue, then yes. So every nation, tribe, people, and language is reversing Babel here. Babel is where the nations get divided up and all the peoples and the languages get formed. And this is reversing that. The many are being regathered as one here. But it gives us an idea of how far the gospel has to go. And because we can identify languages much more easily today, there's a lot of languages left to go.
What about dead languages?
Right. And people from dead languages be represented there. Some of them surely, but all of them? Hard to say.
Yeah.
Moving along into Revelation 8 and 9, we see the seventh seal gets opened, and it is followed by silence in heaven, which lasts for about half of an hour. Which is interesting because here you see that in heaven they are somewhat subject to time. Heaven is not outside of time in John's vision.
Okay, that's kind of interesting.
Yup. But it makes sense if you think of God creating the heavens and the earth, and time being created at the same time as the heavens and the earth. But God still exists outside of time and space, and the highest heaven can't contain him. So,
God exists outside of heaven.
yeah.
Yeah, that's.
But then where does he exist in?
Yes.
Yes, eternity. So the more significant thing that happens when the seventh seal is opened is the 7 trumpets are given out to 7 angels. So the seventh seal is the inauguration of the 7 trumpets. 6 of them get opened in chapters 8 and 9. Before that, a golden censer, which is something you burn incense in. Man, the connections between flannel graph and Foundations for Faith these last few weeks have been astounding. That there were guys getting burned up because they put the wrong fire in a censer before offering it before the Lord.
And the girls were so ecstatic.
Now
and we
there's-
were like, no.
This was death and judgment. They're not
Oh my gosh, dude, I swear, they're getting exposed to the Bible so much and it's good, but it's like, they're getting used to death and like, we've been going through life of Paul and literally every single week they're like, is he dead yet? When is he gonna die? Like,
Yeah.
Oh
It
heavens.
didn't help that the whole congregation laughed when she said.
Yes.
yeah, that doesn't help.
I know. Honest question. Everybody busted the gut laughing. Anyway,
It's an
angel.
R-rated book.
Huh?
The Bible is rated R.
It is a very R-rated book. Yes. Anyway, so golden censer gets hurled to earth with all of its flames and such going with it, and then the trumpets start sounding.
Golden censer, could that be a meteor?
Right, so we have lots of meteor options in the trumpets. First trumpet here we have hail and fire mixed with blood, and it says that 1/3 of the earth and 1/3 of the trees are burned up, but all of the grass.
Conservation's
that
not
work?
a good day.
Right. But think back to the Old Testament. What prophecies do we remember that have trees in them?
All I can think of is Lebanon.
Mm-hmm.
Lebanon has trees.
Remember Nebuchadnezzar's dream of a tree?
Oh,
He
it's
was a
chopped down.
tree that gets chopped down. What is it significant of?
Kingdom.
His kingdom.
So 1/3 of all the
So this is not necessarily the forest getting knocked down. This could be 1/3 of countries or kingdoms being destroyed.
Dude, the
That
connections
makes
go
so much more
crazy.
sense. It would
Maybe.
make so much more sense.
Wait, so in that, what would the green grass?
Yeah, what's the
potentially
grass?
represent? Would that just be like
People?
people groups?
That would be the people under the trees. So, but if 1/3 of the trees, but all of the grass get burned up, that doesn't leave anyone left on Earth. So that's a hard interpretation because there's clearly people left to experience the rest of these. So this is a regular thing in the Revelation. If this means this, but all of them are gone, then who's left over for later? So this is where it gets challenging interpreting. It could just simply mean the trees.
That means we're a multiplanetary species.
No comment. So the second trump is blown, and a huge blazing mountain hits the sea, and 1/3 of the sea turns to blood, and 1/3 of the creatures die, and 1/3 of the ships are destroyed.
That could be a meteor.
That could be a meteor. Yes, could easily be such. Landing in perhaps the Pacific Ocean, the opposite side from the Earth. Or perhaps the Indian, could be the Atlantic though too. Hard to say. Third trumpet. It says a great star fell from the sky. The star is named Wormwood. 1/3 of the waters turn bitter and many die.
Wormwood is connected with bitter water in other places,
Yes, wormwood is something that you use to make things bitter. It just simply means bitter in some ways, actually.
Used to make things better?
Yeah, wormwood is a type of plant, and you use that plant to make something bitter.
I don't know why you.
Certain cocktails specifically use bitters, which is made out of wormwood
Yep.
as a flavoring.
Yep.
Interesting.
I'm sure there's other things other than that. That's just the thing that I could think of off the top of my head that uses it.
Yep. So once again here we have a star, which could be a star. Obviously it's not going to be like a sun magnitude star, but
Yeah, you
the stars in scriptures will refer to any heavenly body like the planets or an asteroid, anything that shines and gives light, short of the sun or the moon. So it could be something else along those lines. Could also be an angel though. And one of the interesting connections that a lot of people have made since 1986 is that Chernobyl is a Ukrainian or Russian word that is related to bitter and wormwood. It is actually a mugwort, mugwort, which is related to the wormwood plant. And so ever since Chernobyl blew up, everybody reading this passage has been like, it has something to do with nuclear holocaust or something.
That
And
would make sense in this, or
Mhm.
not necessarily nuclear holocaust, but a nuclear meltdown could release nuclear waste that would then turn waters bitter in a sense and cause much death.
which brings out another important way of reading and understanding the book of Revelation is John was writing this to first century believers in Asia who had a Greek culture and society and, most importantly, Greek technology and understanding. Would they have any comprehension of what he was talking about if he was referring to Chernobyl and radioactive waste?
Yeah, no.
Nope.
Right. So there's an interesting balance because he was probably writing of some things that they could not comprehend,
Or he couldn't come.
or he couldn't comprehend, but he also was writing in ways that they could comprehend. So which one is this one going towards? We don't know. Moving along in the trumpets, we have the fourth trumpet, which strikes a third of the sun, a third of the moon, and a third of the stars, so that a third of the day and a third of the night are without light. The third is getting repetitive here, as you can see. A third of the earth, a third of the trees, a third of the sea, a third of the day, a third of the night.
A third of the ships.
hmm Lots of thirds. And a third of fresh water, too. Then the fifth trumpet is also the first woe, because you have 7 seals, 7 trumpets, and 3 woes, but 3 woes are also 3 of the trumpets. So overlap, keeping everything clear. Here we have another star that comes and unlocks the abyss, and this star is personified as if it's an angelic being, and so that would lend more credence towards the third trumpet star also being some sort of angelic being. But anyway, a star unlocks the abyss. We don't know what the abyss is. It's referenced in just a handful of places in the scripture. It is ruled by Abaddon, or the destroyer. And locusts come out and torment those who are unsealed. Remember the 144,000 sealed? Those who don't receive that seal are tormented for 5 months.
Aren't the locusts described?
Yes, the locusts are described, and I'm not going to go into the description because it's too much detail for our time constraints here today.
Locusts I've ever seen.
Right, they don't. And yep, so that's another interesting mystery. What are those locusts? The sixth trumpet is the second woe. 4 angels get released and they kill a third of mankind. Which would point towards the trees and the green grass maybe not being mankind earlier. But it also says there's the number of mounted troops, and that's 200 million. But then it goes on to describe the horses and their riders. And there's a description of a lot of them that's on par with the locusts, unlike any mounted horseman that I've ever seen or heard of. And this actually brings out something that I was meditating on several years ago. I was reading a book that's completely unrelated to the scriptures called The Rise and the Fall of the Great Powers.
Yes.
So basically, a conversation we had.
I was
Yes.
talking to Joel about that earlier today.
And anyhow, so in that book, it talks about a lot of European history that happened between 1500 and 2000 roughly. And one of the recurring themes of the book is how large of an army is any nation or kingdom able to field at any point in time, is kind of how to, measure their relative power. And one of the points in the book that was made is that France in 1917 fielded the largest percentage of their population as an army at one time that is known in the history of the world. And the French at that point were only able to put 20% of their population out on the field in their military forces. That's not necessarily the largest army, but it was the highest as a percentage of their population. So that's only 1 in 5 people that would be troops. So you start extrapolating that, and you realize the size of population that would be necessary for 200 million troops to be fielded by a single country.
One nation.
If it was from a single nation, you would need at least a population of 1 billion. But then the other thing that I recognized is that that nation would have to be facing an existential threat as worrisome as Germany was to France in 1917 to warrant the amount of energy and expenditure necessary to put them in. And one of the further thoughts that I had is the only reason why France was able to field that size of an army is because the United States was shipping an inordinate amount of food and clothing over to France to support that army in that war.
That's a giant economy.
Yes. And so one of the things that has only happened in the last couple of hundred years is that the population of the earth has actually gotten large enough for this to be theoretically possible. But I say theoretically possible because right now you've got huge nations like China and India, but they only have 1 million or 2 million people in their armed forces. Like, they are not remotely close to mobilized to the point where they could field an army of 200 million.
What, to arm?
Hmm?
To arm an
Right.
army of 200 million? That's insane.
So if another world war breaks out and you have nations arming themselves like they did in World War I and World War II, then you might start getting closer to those numbers. But even so, you've got just a massive amount of men and material that would have to be mobilized for a war effort of some sort. All that just to say is I'm not terribly concerned about that trumpet sounding anytime too soon. Moving along. Revelation 10, we have another vision here. John sees a mighty angel coming down from heaven. It shouts, and the 7 thunders speak when that angel shouts. John is just about to write down what the 7 thunders say, but he is forbidden to write down what the 7 thunders said. Every now and again, you'll have somebody say that I was taken to heaven in a vision, and this is what I saw. And one of the important things to remember is that both Paul and John saw things in heaven that they were forbidden to speak about. If somebody can actually share what they saw in heaven, they didn't see too much. If they're forbidden to speak of things, then maybe they saw something. Anyway, the angel has a scroll, and John is able to take that scroll, and he's told to eat it. And it's sweet as honey in his mouth, but his stomach turns sour from eating it. And what that means is also another mystery. Something to do with what he's speaking.
Does the scroll get opened? Or just, like...
Had words on both sides, I believe, but the words that were on the scroll are not written or spoken of in the book. So then moving into Revelation 11, we have the 2 witnesses, and this is another sort of independent vision here that John has. It says they're given power to prophesy for 1,260 days, which I believe is 42 months or 3.5 years if you're working off a lunar calendar. And that number of days or number of months is a recurring number through the book of Revelation and also in Daniel. It says the beast from the abyss overpowers them, and this is interesting because the beast has actually not been introduced yet in the book of Revelation, but he's referenced here. So the two witnesses get killed. For 3.5 days, people from every people, nation, tribe, and tongue are able to see them, and then they get raised from the dead and they ascend into heaven. And one of the other points of great controversy are who are these two witnesses? Some people think they're Moses and Elijah. Some people think that they are Jews and the church. Some people think they are John the Baptist and somebody else. Don't know who the two witnesses are. But they have pretty amazing
Wait.
power to speak,
So
and they can
people say-
prevent rain from coming on places on the earth.
When people say Jews in the church, are they saying the witnesses is like two like all of the Jews and all of the?
Mm-hmm. Yep.
That would be a lot of death.
Yep.
They're struck down.
Yeah, and they're witnessing in Jerusalem is the implication of the passage. It doesn't specify Jerusalem, but there's a couple implications. When they ascend into heaven, there's a severe earthquake and 1/10 of the city collapses. Several earthquakes that take place. And then right after this, we come back to the 7th trumpet, which is the third woe. And this is only described from heaven. So what happens on earth is not described. It's just commentary in the heavens. It says, the kingdom of the world has become the kingdom of our Lord and his Christ. The time has come for judgment. But it doesn't describe how that is manifested on the earth. Any questions up to this point here?
Doesn't sound like an enjoyable time to be on the earth.
No, it doesn't sound like a pleasant time to be on the earth. There's actually a connection between the trumpets and one of Paul's passages is when he's describing what a lot of people call the rapture. It says when the last trumpet is sounded, and that may be connected to these trumpets.
Going back a little bit, is the 200 million mounted troops after a third of the population has been killed?
Let's go back and see. Nope, that's when the 4 angels are released and kill a third of the mankind. Presumably the 4 angels use war to kill a third of mankind.
Oh, okay.
That's a lot of people.
That is a lot of people. Yeah, a third of the earth right now would be over 2 billion people. It'd be about 2.6. So that is a lot of people passing away.
That's like if you just wiped India and China off the map completely.
Mm-hmm.
We've got a lot of people dying from the trumpets before then too.
Yeah.
Man, cemeteries will not be sufficient.
Nope.
I think it's interesting with the two witnesses where it says the whole world basically saw them,
Mm-hmm.
watched them, looked at them while they're dead. Well, in that time period, that would have been impossible.
Mm-hmm.
In our time period, completely easy.
Satellite TV.
Yep.
That is one of the things that is now possible and explainable. That was a mystery beyond all mysteries that Christian writers wrote about for a long time, is how are people gonna look at these 2 dead witnesses for 3.5 days?
Yeah.
John
Wow,
must have
that
thought this is some kind of a sign that's hidden from me.
Right, right.
You wonder what is written now where we wonder, and in 500 years it's like, well, duh.
Yep. But I think that's probably why some people thought it was the Jews and the church, because if they're scattered around the earth, then people
Oh.
would be able to see them dead in both
Yeah.
places. But it's all hard to say. All right, so getting out of Revelation 11, we jump into Revelation 12. And I feel like there is a huge jump and other people have interpreted it that way as well, because the seventh trumpet seems like we're hitting the end of the age, and the kingdom of the earth has become the kingdom of our Lord, and then we go into all kinds of more stuff. So everything that we've gotten from Revelation 4 through Revelation 11 is sometimes described as having a heavenly perspective, and then when we jump into Revelation 12, we're shifting to more the earth view. Annabelle.
Has the seventh seal been broken yet? Because I feel like we talked about
The seventh seal was broken and became the seven trumpets. The trumpets were issued to the angels when the seventh seal was opened. The contents of the scroll were not actually ever described, though. We don't know what was written on it. That was a different scroll.
Oh,
Yeah.
Oh my gosh, and remember Tyler's interpretation of this?
Oh, please don't bring it up now.
I actually don't. It's probably a good thing though.
Yep. All right. So I have women. It should be woman. That's not plural. So you have the woman and the dragon. And Revelation 12 is rather challenging because some people think it has not yet happened, and other people think this has already happened, and some people just can't answer. And so you have a pregnant woman. She's clothed with the sun, and she has a crown of 12 stars. Once again, are those stars real stars? Or is it symbolic of something other than an angel, or are they just angels? She gives birth to a son. A red dragon, which is named as the devil or Satan, the accuser, tries to devour the child. The woman is taken into the desert for 1,260 days. We see that number again. And the tail of the dragon sweeps a third of the stars out of the sky.
People who think it already happened, what do they think it was?
That would be when Satan rebelled against God some point shortly after the creation and was thrown to earth.
Oh, that
So-
was...
and brought with him
Oh, and
1/3
brought
of
with him.
And took a third of the angels with him.
Is that the only place where we get that third of the angels with him?
Yeah, this is that place.
Wait.
So we actually don't know that.
We don't actually, yeah.
Wait.
That's assuming that the stars are angels.
How would that even work though? Because the woman's taken into the desert for 1,260 days.
I'm not sure what you're questioning about.
Well, the timing. If that was when Satan rebelled, that'd be before that.
Yeah, I know. So the woman giving birth, sometimes people interpret the woman to be Israel giving birth to Jesus, who Satan tries to devour but can't. But that one's hard to totally nail down because the 1,260 days in the desert,
Egypt.
maybe the time in Egypt, but that wasn't really that long that they were down there.
Oh.
So, but then this chapter continues and just adds to the mystery. It says there's war in heaven. Michael and his angels fight against the dragon and his
Oh,
angels.
this is when Michael's
So-
mentioned.
This is one of the places Michael's mentioned. He's also in the Old Testament.
Oh, really?
Mm-hmm. Daniel chapter 12.
Mm.
And so this, I think, makes a stronger connection between the third of the stars as being actually fallen angels. So then the dragon gets hurled to earth with his angels and pursues the woman, fails to get her, and then he goes and makes war against the saints. So one of the challenges about this having already happened is that in Job, Satan is very clearly in the throne room of God with him in heaven, and he seems to have access up there that he does not have at the end of this chapter.
Right.
So that would be challenging. Some people connected to a verse that Jesus, when he was talking to his disciples who'd come back, and they said, I saw Satan fall like lightning from heaven, and they're like, it happened then, during the gospel accounts. Outside chance, arguments for and against. Other people think that this is something that has yet to happen, and that, the Jehovah's Witnesses think that this happened in 1914. It is a really crazy fluke of things. They would not be a thing if it weren't for the outbreak of World War I in the very same year that they predicted the end of the world was going to happen.
Gracious.
Yes, they predicted the end of the world in October of 1914. So as the armies of Europe start marching on each other and death and carnage are breaking out, they are just convinced Jesus is returning any day. And when he had not returned by the end of 1915, they had to come up with an alternative interpretation of what they thought to be true. And their conclusion is that Jesus was enthroned in the heavens and it hasn't happened on earth yet, but we're really close.
Wow, so basically they made a guess and it looked really, really promising, and so they got super static, and then it didn't turn out and they had to make an alternative.
Yes. And so this is a sign of a person falsely interpreting a prophecy is when they claim nothing happened on earth that we know of in this time, and so obviously it must have happened in the heavenlies. And I've seen this and read this in lots of different places for various different years, because somebody will calculate that according to this, such and such a thing should have happened in such and such a year. It must have happened in the heavens. But anyhow, then we end up with the dragon on the seashore and next to the sea. And a beast comes up out of the sea. This is probably the same beast that is referenced in Revelation chapter 11. Kind of ironic, he's not described well up there, but he comes in full description here. The beast has 10 horns and 7 heads. One head had a fatal wound which had healed. The beast is given power by the dragon, makes war against the saints, and he's given authority over every tribe, people, language, and nation. And he's worshipped by the inhabitants of the earth.
A global superpower
Yeah,
of
that's.
some sort, whether it be political superpower, economic.
Alright, so let's think about this, because what's our connection point into the Old Testament so that we can have some semblance of a better understanding of what we're looking at here. Daniel's various critters. So,
Didn't Alexander the Great get some kind of a fatal wound that he recovered from?
quite a few times probably. Now that you mentioned it. That guy was insane. His army was laying siege to a city and nobody wanted to climb up onto the ladder first, and so he puts all of his men to shame by climbing up on the ladder first. Stands on top of the wall, a perfect shot for an archer, and then he jumps into the city. When he disappears over the edge of the wall, the one and only man from their army, the whole rest of the army starts climbing up the ladders. 2 men get up onto the top of the wall and jump down alongside of him. Meanwhile, the ladder breaks under the crush of men climbing up behind him. Alexander the Great gets mortally wounded. He only has 2 men defending him inside the city, but he survives.
And the army's like, we gotta get
Yes, and that city fell really fast because the army came over the walls so fast after he went in there.
How to rally your men.
Yes, how to rally your men during a siege. Beat them into the city. So good.
By yourself.
Yes. Anyhow, I think if you remember the Macedonian example, you have the 4 horns. It first had 1 large horn. The large horn is broken off and is replaced by 4 horns. So what does a horn here represent?
A king.
A king or a kingdom.
Or kingdom.
And the beast itself is kind of like a culture or a form of government, so to speak. And so, because you have 4 Macedonian ruled kingdoms. So these are Greek cultured kingdoms that are ruling over 4 different places that Daniel sees as a single empire, even though after Alexander the Great's dead, they were never a single united empire.
But they had the same culture.
But they had a similar cultural approach to ruling, and they originated out of Alexander the Great's conquest. So 10 horns leaves a lot of options open there, as does the 7 heads.
What would the heads represent?
Yeah, we actually get back to that again in Revelation 17, so we're going to hold off on that. So then we have a second beast. This is a beast out of the earth, whereas the other one came out of the sea. There's some significance to their different places of origin, the likes of which I can't make sense of myself. Sometimes this second one is known as the false prophet. That's how he's referenced a few times later in the book of Revelation. I didn't see that reference in Revelation 13. So this beast has 2 horns, like a lamb. It exercises authority on behalf of the first beast, performs miraculous signs and wonders, and can call down fire from heaven.
Light.
That has been considered to be electricity, lightning, atomic bombs, throwing down bolts from heaven, just all kinds of options. Sets up an image of the first beast, breathes life into that image, and then he forces all to get the mark of the beast in order to have any economic activity option, buying and selling. That mark is 666, which John says is man's number. So 6 being man's number is because man was created on the 6th day of creation. That there's 3 of them probably is connecting it to the Trinity, probably some idea of man being set up as God. But this is a mystery. All kinds of people have all kinds of ideas of what that is. I have heard it be represented as a tattoo. I've heard it represented as a barcode. As of recently, it's really popular to think it's getting chipped, and there's just no end to the options of what it could be. Credit cards, checking accounts, Federal Reserve, dollar bills. Lots of options.
If it's a dollar bill, then I'm in trouble.
Shoot, I know. Exactly. So, I'm not terribly concerned that anyone in this day and age has already gotten the mark of the beast, because I think that we'll have some strong concept of what it is when we see it. Alright, we're hitting a little bit after 8 o'clock. So our options are, we try to accelerate and speed up, we pause and come back to this. Thoughts, opinions?
I can delay.
That was the fastest 45 minutes we've ever had here.
I know.
Yeah.
I know.
13 chapters into 22.
I'd want to keep going.
Okay.
2 minutes.
Same.
Okay, we'll keep going. I have time. Revelation 14. This isn't even the entirety of it, but there's 3 angels here that come and they fly through between heaven and earth. Mid-air, I think is what's described. The first one is given the gospel, and he says, "Fear God, for the hour of judgment has come," among other things. The second angel proclaims, "Fallen is Babylon the Great." The third angel proclaims a judgment if anyone worships the beast or receives his mark, they will drink of God's fury.
So, presumably, if those who receive the mark are getting punished, we should know what it is when it comes around, so that those who want to follow God can choose to define it.
Right. Somehow receiving the mark is also associated with worshiping the beast. And since worshiping the beast is not worshiping God, it seems like we should be able to identify and perceive it. I trust that the Holy Spirit inside of us will say something to us if we are present in that day.
Yeah.
That's an F, yep. So then, Revelation 15 and 16 are the pouring out of the bowls of wrath. Now, some people think that there's overlap here and that the 7 bowls of God's wrath are related to the 7 seals and the 7 trumpets. Some people think that these are 7 independent judgments and issues. I will leave that to you to determine, because I can see some connections, but I can also not fail to see other ones. Not a lot of overlap, honestly. So the first bowl, they actually remind me of the plagues of Egypt. You have ugly and painful sores breaking out on people. The second bowl of God's wrath, you have the sea turning to blood, and everything that's in the sea dies. So the last time a third of the creatures of the sea die, this time all the creatures of the sea die. Third bowl, the rivers and the springs then turn to blood.
Well, that's got implications.
Yep, drinking water's in short supply. The fourth bowl, the sun scorches people with fire. The fifth bowl, darkness comes on the kingdom of the beast. This really sounds like Egypt all over again.
Yeah.
It sounds like environmental protection goes just absolutely nuts and does not work.
Yeah, the sun scorching people with fire. I do believe in global warming.
I know.
Not in the sense that they want us to believe now necessarily, but.
It happens in one form or another.
Exactly.
The earth will be destroyed by fire.
And then it's possible that the sea turning to blood. Could it be pollution?
It's gonna stink, whatever it is.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Literally.
Yeah. Now the sixth and the seventh bowls really get accelerated here, and it really starts hammering out. So the sixth bowl dries up the river Euphrates, and 3 spirits go forth from the mouth of the beast to gather the kings of the earth to Armageddon. And this is where you might have some connections back to, say, the 200 million mounted troops and such. And so you might have a convergence of events coming on here where the 7 trumpets are leading towards Armageddon, and the 7 bowls of God's wrath much more clearly are leading towards Armageddon. But otherwise, the connection points are a little bit harder and slipperier to see. So, 7th bowl, there's a great earthquake. It splits the great city, and I can't tell you which one that is. Rome, Babylon, or Jerusalem would all be good options. Every other city would be a lesser probability. But it splits the great city into 3 parts. All the cities of the nations collapse. So if you ever experience a really bad earthquake, know there's a worse one coming. The islands flee and the mountains can't be found.
Flat Earth.
Oh.
Yes, so we'll believe in a flat earth again. And that actually has some corollaries to some Old Testament passages about the valleys being raised up and the mountains being brought low. So I didn't look up any of those Old Testament connection points, but I remember having read about that and seen that other places. And it could be figurative or a symbolic thing as well. Hard to say. There's also a plague of hail, and this is where the hailstones falling from earth are listed as 100 pounds.
Yeah.
That'll mess things up.
That'll mess things up. That is approximately a 10 gallons of water in a frozen hailstone, to give you an idea.
Oh my god.
That.
Fun.
2 5-gallon pails,
God.
basically.
Yes, 2 5-gallon pails of frozen water
It's really.
falling from the sky.
So start designing a bunker that can handle earthquakes, hundreds of pounds of water hopping on it, and has a huge amount of fresh water.
An incredible fresh water supply that somehow isn't able to be turned into blood
You also would need
when angels
to
fly
design
over.
it to withstand water erosion, because all of that hail would then theoretically melt. That's a lot of water.
And figure out food.
But you actually bring up an interesting point here. So this is one of the major hang-ups of why a lot of believers believe in the rapture. Now, the rapture is a much more recent theological proposition. It was not even an idea until about the 1850s, 1860s, or something like that.
Really?
Yes, really. Recent
Whoa.
idea. The word rapture does not come across in the scriptures. Some passages seem to describe something of it, but a lot of people decided, I don't want to go through this. God must take us out of this, right? And they do have a good point, because it does talk about how God has not saved up his wrath for us. His wrath does not get poured out on believers. However, one of the things to remember from the Old Testament is that the Israelites were spared the majority of the plagues of Egypt from one point on. They experienced the first 3, and then 4 onwards, I think they totally missed. So God's wrath was poured out on Egypt, and the Israelites were spared. And in the same days, in the days of Noah and his family were spared the judgment, or spared in the flood. So the idea that God can't selectively judge the world and miss all of the believers fails to take into consideration what he has done extremely well in the Old Testament. Even on the day where the sun stood still, Joshua was fighting against the Canaanites, and a hailstorm came up, and the hailstones were picking off Canaanites without picking off Israelites.
I feel
And
like
Yeah,
more
there's
people
some
died
stories.
from the hail than died from the sword.
that sounds miserable.
Yes, it does sound quite miserable.
That's like God stoning
hmm
people.
So, as awful as all this sounds, I'm confident that we won't experience the worst of this because we're not subject to God's wrath.
You'll find out who's Christian real quick.
Yep, you will. Moving on from the wrath, we have this chapter that goes back to the beast. You have the woman on the beast. The woman's dressed in purple and scarlet. She's known as the great prostitute. Kings of the earth committed adultery with her. She's sitting on a scarlet beast with 7 heads and 10 horns. So
So
that's
this is a different woman?
the same, huh?
It's a different woman?
A same beast.
No, different woman.
Different woman?
Like, well, there's the.
Oh yeah, it's not the woman that the dragon was trying to devour. Yes, definitely a different woman. Same beast, different woman. So, think back to the Old Testament. Where does God use the theme of prostitution all the time?
Israel.
Yes. And what was Israel doing that God was calling prostitution?
Idol worship?
Idol worship. Right. False religion. So Babylon the Great, the woman dressed in purple and scarlet, is often thought to be a false religion. And it could actually be the religion introduced at the Tower of Babel way back when, because just like things in Genesis in the early part wrap up in Revelation, Tower of Babel is early in Genesis and it wraps up in Revelation.
What religion?
The false gods that originated out of Babel were shifted into different forms in all the other ancient cultures. So Marduk would have been one of the original gods.
Is it possible that it's also the religion that there isn't religion, which would be considered atheism?
Not likely.
Not likely.
No.
So the world gets religious again.
Maybe, or maybe this is just all of history's false religions
Right.
woven together. But anyway, then it says on her head is Mystery, Babylon the Great, the mother of prostitutes. So that would be the idea, is like the origin of all the false religions that have come, because it seems to have originated at Babel, which is connected to Babylon, and to the abominations of the earth. At the same time, as written right there, it's a mystery. Now, it does elaborate on the beast a good deal more. I don't know that this necessarily strips it of any mystery, but we do learn a few things here. So the beast once was, now is not, and yet will come. The now being in John's day for sure, because that's when he wrote it. Once was, now is not, and yet will come. Then it says the 7 heads are 7 hills and 7 kings. There are 7 hills in Rome, and so oftentimes it gets connected to Rome because of the 7 hills of Rome.
Wasn't the Babylonian palace, didn't that have 7 layers or levels?
Ecbatana did, but not in Babel that I know of. Of those 7 kings, it says 5 have fallen, which would be past tense from John's point of view. 1 is, and 1 is yet to come. The beast itself is an 8th king, which belongs to the 7, and then the 10 horns are 10 kings, and they give their power to the beast. So we now have 18 kings, or kingdoms, thrown out here on the same beast.
One of which is the beast.
Yep, one of which is the beast. Is it about as clear as mud?
As they're going to say, yes.
Revelation 18 describes the fall of Babylon. It's overtaken by plagues in one day, plagues of death, mourning, and famine. Had been a trading center and exceedingly prosperous, and the loss of Babylon is mourned by traders and sea captains. Now, Babylon itself is a landlocked city. It had a river port at best. So that's why a lot of people think that this isn't actually speaking of the original Babylon, but it's actually speaking of Rome, because Rome had a seaport. And of course, John was writing in the days of the Roman Empire, and Rome was the center of power at that point in time. Still yet a mystery. Destroyed by fire in 1 hour. Modern commentators wonder about a nuclear holocaust, but that is the mystery and the question. Getting close to the end here, Revelation 19 seems to describe the Battle of Armageddon, which would look like it is perhaps the 7th trumpet and the 7th bowl overlapping here. But they could be put together differently. But anyhow, you have the rider on a white horse. His name is the Word of God. And it's interesting that John is writing this, because John writes his gospel and introduces Jesus as what?
The Word.
The Word. He's leading the armies of heaven. I mean, it's not a really strong mystery here, because it says King of Kings and Lord of Lords on his thigh. And the beast and the kings of the earth make war against him, are defeated. The beast is captured along with the false prophet. They get thrown into the lake of fire, and the armies with them are killed by the sword. And it calls forth all the birds of the air to feast on the flesh of those who die and perish in that battle. Yes.
A lot of birds left.
A lot of birds survive all of that, yes. Lots and lots of birds. It could be a good season of the world for vultures. They could do well. Not pleasant, but they have a purpose in the world too. Yep, let's see here. So then moving on, we're shifting out of the end of this age, because that is considered to be the end of the age, and we shift into a different age here, known as the millennium. Now this is one of those fascinating things where a completely new concept is thrown into the Bible in the 3rd to last chapter. However, in light of this chapter, several things in Isaiah and several things in other passages make more sense. You have the dragon, which would be Satan, bound and locked into the abyss for 1,000 years. Christ reigns on earth for 1,000 years, along with those who had been beheaded for not receiving the mark of the beast. And one of the implications is that people survive the Battle of Armageddon. It is not all death and destruction across the entire face of the earth, because they have to reign over something, precisely, and there are people that can later be deceived. And so, like, we just went through the bowls of God's wrath, and there's a remnant that get through this having not believed the entire time, and then they are ruled by Christ.
I almost feel bad for them. So they have to go through all of that, and then get ruled over for 1,000 years. Like, obviously they chose to believe, and then they presumably get deceived again.
Or their descendants.
Or their descendants.
Yes. So then we quickly move into Satan being released from the abyss, and he goes and deceives the nations again. And one of the key things that I think should be pointed out here is we no longer can perceive the passage of time. 1,000 years just went by, and that could be a literal 1,000 years or it could be a figurative 1,000 years. Either way, once Satan is released, it says he has to be released for a short while, which should be understood in the context of Jesus is coming soon. So, the millennium is usually understood as the 7th age of the earth, and then we have more events after that that are only sparsely spoken of. So you remember that idea of mountaintop prophecy, where you can see what's in front of you more clearly, and you can see the next huge events, and you can see there's big events behind them, but you can't see a whole lot more.
After John.
I highly suspect that Revelation 20 has a lot of that, because John could not see much of what was happening during the millennium. He only could see that Jesus was reigning and who was reigning with him, and nothing else is mentioned really of what happens in there. He sees Satan getting released. That's the next big event. and he deceives the nations and gathers them for another battle. How long does that all take? It's not recorded, doesn't say, doesn't even hint at it, other than a little while. Just rather ambiguous. There is a connection here to another prophetic or apocalyptic passage. Ezekiel 38 talks about Gog and Magog being gathered to Jerusalem. A lot of people interpret Ezekiel 38 as being a war that triggers the tribulation and is associated with the rapture of the saints away from earth through the whole tribulation and such. I can't make that connection in my own head. The only place that I can connect Ezekiel 38 to is this next great battle after Armageddon, because that's the only other point in Scripture that Gog and Magog are mentioned.
So there's
to my
Armageddon,
knowledge.
and then there's Gog and Magog being prepared for battle.
Mhm.
That's the second.
Yes, and I'll tell you, everybody else I've ever talked to has the Battle of Gog and Magog first and Armageddon coming next like 7 years later. I think they're reversed and that they've got over 1,000 years in between them. That's my own personal opinion. I don't know how many places you'll find anybody supporting that.
I mean, it would make sense if you lose all the.
Yeah, you're easy to convince.
I am.
All right. So everybody gets gathered for battle. They get devoured by fire from heaven. Satan gets thrown into the lake of fire. And then we shift into the great white throne judgment. Once again, passage of time is really hard to nail down here. All of a sudden, the earth and the sea are no more. And so we've got something very different going on. It's a great white throne. All the dead. All the dead get judged. The sea gives up its dead. Hades gives up its dead. The dead are judged for their deeds. Those not found in the book of life are thrown into the lake of fire. It's getting late. Can't talk straight quite. And then we shift into all of the connections back to Eden, where we have a new heaven and a new earth. And this is a contentious passage, because does God actually physically destroy this planet and the entire universe as we know and create another one? Or does it just look like it's a new earth because just like after the flood and the earth had been destroyed by water, it looked really different, and so it looked like a new earth.
It's remodeled.
Heavily remodeled by fire, precisely. Can't say. The new heaven would seem to imply that there are different star arrangements in the constellations, but it actually isn't really speaking about that. So, I don't know. It says there's a new heaven and a new earth, and I'm content with going with that. And then it goes super figuratively, because you have Jerusalem descending from heaven. Jerusalem is the bride of Christ, which is the church, and it's this cubed city that's 1,200 miles in every dimension. So,
It's like as big as
Go
the
figure
United
that.
States.
maybe it was 300 miles.
In
1,200 stadia, I think. 300 miles.
Is that
That's still
including
huge.
height?
Yes, 300 miles high, wide, and such. So 300 miles, to give you an idea, takes you up into low Earth orbit where satellites are hanging out. So 300 miles high is serious. The new Earth does not have a sea. It's land only.
Well, that's sad.
Where do the rivers go?
Yeah, the river flows somewhere.
That's like Jack
'Cause there is a
Sparrow's
river.
worst nightmare.
It's like what?
Jack Sparrow's worst nightmare.
No sea.
No.
Yes. Alright, so there's a river of life, has the tree of life growing along its shores. The river flows from the throne of God. There is no sun. It's a really different existence. The leaves of the tree of life are for the healing of the nations. That's what I'm looking forward to.
Okay, for some reason, the tree of life, I always think of the one tree in Gondor, I think it is.
Oh.
Which is dead.
I know.
Yep. So then the book closes. John identifies himself again as the one who has received the visions and written them down. He gives a warning against adding or taking anything away from the revelation. It's important to remember that that warning was specifically about the book of Revelation and not the entirety of the Bible. But it's not a good idea to add anything to the rest of Scripture either. So that's a lot to take in.
How do we know it's just referring to the book of Revelation?
Go ahead and open it up. I think it's this third
Last page
to
of the
last
Bible.
verse, yeah. Last page of the Bible, Revelation 22, 3 or 4 verses from the end.
I warn everyone who hears the words of the prophecy of this book. If anyone adds to them, God lied to the plagues described in this book, that's for it was. If anyone takes away from the words of this prophecy, God will take away sharing the tree of life from the holy city which are described in this book.
Yeah.
So the description of that seems to be connecting it specifically to the book of Revelation. I kind of use it as a rule of thumb for the rest of the Bible too, so
Yeah.
mind your point. So, lots of symbolism, lots of connections back to the Old Testament, lots of mystery, hard to fully understand it. Anybody who thinks they do know it doesn't. And there are lots of different interpretations of how it could come together. My own perspective on it is that it's a good idea to be familiar with the things so that we're ready to start identifying things if we happen to live in that season. I don't stress on it too much though, because we have the Holy Spirit living inside of us and He can inform us when it's necessary. There are very few things that we would need to avoid doing other than taking on the mark of the beast, which somehow is worshiping a global empire of some sort in its way. So, not a great fear of mine. I trust the Holy Spirit will show me in the time.
Although it does say people are beheaded for not taking
Yep.
the
So there will be the fear of death that is compelling people to take it, which is pretty compulsory. It's an authoritarian government with more power than is presently found on Earth today. So it would not fly in the United States without several cultural shifts and changes that would take a couple of generations to institute. Yeah. And strangely enough, you can thank the ACLU for that.
The what?
American Civil Liberties Union. So, all right, we can close off the recording.